So welcome to our new ZEW book talk. It's a particular pleasure for me to welcome our today's speaker, Ludger Schuknecht. But before I introduce Ludger, let me thank our ZEW Förderkreis, the Sponsors Association for Science and Practice, for their support of our book talk series. So it's a pleasure to have Ludger Schuknecht with us. He's with us today from Singapore, where he's a visiting professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Ludger has a whole series of prestigious positions in his CV. So he was for 2 years a deputy Secretary General at the OECD. Before that, he served in the German Ministry of Finance from the years 2011 to 2018 as a chief economist. I think it's fair to say he had a big impact on the era of Wolfgang Schäuble as a German Minister of Finance in this period. Before that, he held positions at the European Central Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund. So it's amazing, this collection of national and international positions. He studied in the United States and Germany. He received his PhD at the University of Constance on a trade policy topic. And what I found also remarkable about Ludger is that he always kept close contacts to academia. I mean, if you look at his list at Google Scholar and his citations, Ludger's really outbeating, I think it's fair to say, most of the economic chairs, even at the very good German universities, with his work on fiscal policy, government spending, government efficiency. More than 20 years ago, he co-authored a book together with Vito Tanzi on public spending in the 20th century, A Global Perspective. And now, with today's book, he has come back to that topic. So now he has published on its own this very fascinating book on public spending and the role of the state, history, performance, risk and remedies. And this title already, I think, gives a first overview over the topics. And Ludger, we are really enthusiastic about having you with us. And I hand over to you without further ado so that you can give us an overview of your insights in this second major public finance book which you have authored. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Friedrich. It's a great pleasure to be invited to this ZEW series. And it's great to do this. Even here from Singapore, it's one of the things that one probably would not have thought about before the pandemic. So perhaps a little side benefit. You may hear during my talk in the background some loud rumbling. That is not the background music to my talk. It is a thunderstorm that is just taking place here. And I hope it's not going to be too loud. So just as a little warning, because sometimes, one wonders where the noise is coming from. So let me share the screen on the book. Here it is. The book basically does indeed what Friedrich has said. I mean, it starts with the history of public spending. In that sense, it is also an update of the book I did with Vito Tanzi 20 years ago. But then it goes a bit further in the discussion of the challenges over the efficiency and performance of governments, the fiscal risks that we have looking forward, and the role of rules and institutions in our public finance performance and public finance future. And I do take again, quite an international view, not totally global. The focus is mostly on advanced countries, although with some reference to emerging economies, which today, you cannot do without anymore. But the starting point is really the questions, okay, I mean, what do we want to get out of government? What we want from government is to provide basically the core goods and services, the rules of the game for a well-functioning economy and society. And in an earlier research, I did some correlations on, public spending versus trust in government, and government performance and trust in government. And I thought that trust in government is perhaps a good indicator of, so to speak, of whether government is doing a good job or not. If people trust government, they think it's doing a good job, and if not, then it isn't. And what this research shows is that there's a strong correlation between the good performance of government. You can measure that by infrastructure quality, education quality, rule of law, most importantly, and sound public finances, low debt. So there's a good correlation between that. And there is virtually no correlation between the public spending and also with social spending and trust in government. So I think that is kind of the starting point from which I tell the story of public spending. We need, it's not public spending per se, but it is what government does with the public spending. That is what matters. But let me start with the history of public spending. This chart shows you that in about 1870, 150 years ago, governments were very small, very little spending, 10% of GDP, every 10th euro, dollar, whatever the currency of the day was. And governments did very little. A bit of defense, infrastructure, administration, debt service, that was it. And in the following 90 years, this role of government changed very strongly. With it also, I think the what we consider now to be modern states with all the services we appreciate, health, education, infrastructure, well-functioning security, etc. All this emerged over these 90 years, and public spending increased, of course, over this time from about 10 to 28% of GDP in the 22 countries that I look at. And in the next almost 40 years till 2017, before the pandemic, public spending increased further from 28 to 43, 44% on average, a wide dispersion, I will come back to that, between countries. And that additional spending was mainly on additional administration and, most importantly, social spending. And then, as if, so to speak, this was not enough, then came Corona, and with it, our economies, shrank and spending increased, so that the public expenditure ratio in last year was, for these countries, at a bit over 50% of GDP, and for some countries over 60. So we have seen this huge evolution in the role of the state. And now, how does this compare? First, just a quick look at emerging economies. Don't look too much at the details. You just see here that in the pre-corona period, public spending in emerging economies was typically much lower, at least on average. In the Asian countries, around 30%, in emerging economies altogether, a bit higher. Also in Eastern Europe, a bit higher than in the West. And what did the spending dynamics, the additional spending over these 150 years go to? We see here the composition of spending. Education was low in 1870, but the share increased somewhat to a bit over 10% today. So that means public education spending is about 5% of GDP, a little bit over 10%. Investment spending went down from about 20% of total spending, but at that time 2% of GDP, now to less than 10% of total spending, which is about 3% today. So an increase, but a decline in the relative share. But in that kind of increasing role of government, the big winner is social expenditure, which today is 24% of GDP, or pre-corona was at 24%, 1/4 of GDP. Almost 3 times as much as in 1960, when it was at 9% of GDP, and almost 25 times as much as in 1870, where it was at 1% of GDP. So this is a remarkable change in the composition of government. And then the question is, okay, what do citizens get for so much spending? And does it matter how much countries spend for the performance? Do they do better or less good with more public money? And the main finding of this analysis is that in most areas, it doesn't matter. There is no correlation between public expenditure and the government's performance. Here on the left, you see infrastructure, where you have basically you have a cloud of observations where, Sweden with almost 4.5% of GDP is at a similar level as Belgium and Germany with 2 to 2.5%. Germany is now a bit higher. These are the 10-year averages before 2017. And this implies two things. One, it's a bigger role of the private sector in some countries. In Germany, for instance, the private sector plays really quite a role in infrastructure provision, and also a different kind of efficiency of government in providing infrastructure. Interesting also here, the Gini coefficient as a measure of income distribution, where you can see that on the whole, big government countries have a somewhat more equal income distribution than small government countries. But when you look at the 5 countries that are in circle, you have Korea with social spending of only 10% of GDP, Switzerland, Ireland near 20, a bit below, Germany 25, and France over 30. And all these countries have very similar Gini coefficients. For one, because the social spending is less well targeted, typically in the big social spending countries, and also because often countries with smaller government have more well-functioning labor markets and more employment. So this balances out some of the social effects. In a way, in accordance with the old saying, the best social policy is having employment opportunities. On the whole, small governments do a bit better than big governments. You can see that here, especially on the right, where you have the top performers, when you look at a number of indicators from income distribution to economic performance, etc. Switzerland, Australia, and you have some of the big government countries also doing relatively well, like the Nordics, and some doing less well. Now, if one looks at that, I would say that suggests that many countries have room to have savings on their expenditure. Their governments could do equally well or even better with less spending. And over the past 40 years, a number of countries have actually gone through these episodes of reforming the state. And what I find in the book is that these episodes were typically very successful. They were very successful from a fiscal perspective, bringing down expenditure, debt, and deficits, but they were also successful from an economic perspective. Countries that did these ambitious reforms, they also performed better economically afterwards. And that is also true for the crisis countries of the 2010s. The Ireland, Portugal, Spain, UK, an exception maybe Greece, where many people today, where there's a lot of negative communication, but I would say this is not really right. I mean, these countries, their reforms have paid off. They are much more dynamic today than they used to be. Whereas when you look at countries that didn't reform, France, Germany, Italy, their economic dynamism is weaker. And you can also see, interestingly enough, that on the side of income distribution, the reforming countries, you see here the negative bar means more income distribution. Ireland, Portugal, United Kingdom, despite these major reforms, now have more equal income distribution, whereas all the other countries, the non-reforming countries, but also Spain and Greece, have more unequal income distribution. So it's not true if people say, well, that these reforms, they come at the expense of social justice or whatever. The book also looks at fiscal risks in the future. It looks at population aging, and it makes the claim that it is important that we ensure sufficient productive spending also in the future. There's a risk that social spending always dominates in politics and drives out other spending. And one can see that for the past. And when you look at these columns on the left, they show the potential increase in public expenditure over the next decades for social security. They show that this increase is going to be huge. It's going to be roughly the magnitude of a whole education budget. And that we need to make sure it should not come at the expense of productive spending. Also, this slide shows that financial crises typically are very expensive events for public finances. They drive up spending, they drive down GDP, bank bailout costs typically further worsen the picture. So financial crises are a big risk for the future. And maybe I should also mention that we'll have the challenge of climate change and perhaps geopolitical challenges which need to be financed. In the climate area, I would say it's less an expenditure issue, but it's a question of how we do it in an efficient way that it doesn't cost too much growth in the short and medium term. Now, when we look at this picture of expenditure often being very high and not always being as efficient as it should be, and perhaps much higher than need be, we see countries with 30 to 35% of GDP doing well, often better than countries with bigger government. Then the question is, how do we create an environment where these improvements happen? Perhaps it's something we can keep for the discussion, but fiscal rules should feature prominently. We've seen the suspension of fiscal rules during the crisis, the COVID crisis, which is correct, but they should now become operational again. Budget rules and institutions, financial rules and regulations, all these things are there to keep governments effective and debt sustainable. What happened with Corona, with COVID? Well, I mentioned already public expenditure ratios went up a lot. And this picture gives you a bit of a sense of the dispersion of expenditure ratios in advanced countries. The dark blue pillars are 2020. And you see here France at over 60%, Italy near 60, then a couple of countries above or near 50. And then at the end, Switzerland, Ireland with 30 to 35, a bit more percent of GDP. And that shows you, the range and the potential also for change in advanced countries. And the gray bars show somewhat the automatic decline due to the expected recovery in 2021. But there is, of course, a challenge that we really bring down spending back to the pre-corona levels. Why? Also because public debt with the COVID pandemic went to new records to about 140% of GDP in the G7 countries, 120 in the advanced. Emerging economy debt also at record levels. The world is in a way swimming in a lake of debt. And as long as interest rates are very low, this is not a problem. But for the long term, also giving the long-term challenges that I mentioned, this is something we need to keep an eye on. And to my mind, public expenditure reform should be one of the key mechanisms to bring down debt and to ensure that debt is sustainable. Also, this is very important because we, to my mind, need to protect central banks. Central banks have not only played a very important role in supporting the economies in and before the crisis, but they've also taken on a very prominent role through their monetary policies in financing governments. And that the asset purchases kind of automatically finance governments to the magnitude of near 100% of the new debt that was issued in the euro area. They are now major holders of government debt. And that is all fine as long as it can be reversed when the economy normalizes and when monetary policies normalize. But they create this exposure of central banks also creates risk that politicians start relying on it. So let me conclude. Huge growth of government, a lot of it to our benefit, big difference in performance and efficiency that suggests that there is significant scope for expenditure reductions. We have fiscal risks from population aging and in the financial sphere. And in order to master the challenges of the future, I would say we need better and certainly not more spending. We need to return to rules-based policy making, and we need all that in order to have good growth and good, strong opportunities for people, but also to maintain what I mentioned at the beginning, trust in our governments.
Yeah, thanks, Ludger. Thanks a lot for this very concise overview over your fascinating book. So let me start with the first question. So you had written this first comprehensive book 20 years ago, and when you reread your older book now with the experience of the 20 years, and now that you have had another deep look, what were the surprises? So backward looking. So what didn't you really expect, or were there positive surprises in the sense that the fiscal development was much better, or government reform speed was much better? I think in the year 2000 we were unable to foresee, for example, the potential of e-government, digital technologies, and so on. On the other hand, of course, I guess you didn't forecast the financial crisis, your debt crisis. So looking back, what were the big surprises that now also inspired your book?
I would say there are perhaps three. The first is, at the time we had expected that government spending would not grow further as a share of GDP, perhaps even go down further. It was the late 90s, the mid to late 90s. It was really a period where there was strong faith in the market. And it was the time of the convergence towards the euro area, and a lot of governments either had undertaken reform, were undertaking reforms, and there was this consensus that governments should be lean and efficient. And in the last 20 years, we have seen a reversal to a more kind of activist and bigger government approach. The increase is not huge, but for 20 years, I think primary spending, so spending without interest, before COVID went up 3% of GDP. That's not little. That's just about the size of a total investment budget. So, and all of that spending was on social spending. All of that additional spending was social spending. So that we did not predict, but it makes kind of sense from a political economy perspective. That shift towards more activist policies, given the experiences before, and perhaps also to some extent the experiences now after the global financial crisis, I don't know. I did not expect that. The third thing that we didn't have on the radar at all at the time was the fallout from financial crisis. We did already in the previous book speak about population aging. The methodologies were much less well developed, but the basic numbers were already there 20 years ago. But nobody had on the radar the possibility of financial crisis really impacting very strongly on Western budgets. And even though we had the Swedish crisis before, where it already happened, but we didn't discuss it much in the previous book. And the magnitude of increases that we had with countries like Spain, Portugal, Ireland, I mean, this was also much, much more than happened earlier in Sweden or Finland, similar crises.
All these are kind of negative surprises. I mean, wasn't there one big positive surprise, which is the downward trend of the real interest rate that the government have paid to finance all the debt? I mean, you have this nice, impressive chart about the build-up of the debt levels. But in the year 2020, I think we look at the debt level of 100%, maybe much more relaxed than we would have looked at it in the year 2000, given this downward trend in the real interest rate, I think, which is more than just a monetary policy phenomenon when you look at the really long-run trend. So isn't this a key argument to be a bit more relaxed and be more optimistic about the sustainability of all these developments?
This is good point. I mean, point taken. And I should also say that there's a lot of commonalities in the views today. I don't think that anybody would doubt the importance of an efficient state, and nobody doubts the challenges from population aging and so on. But it's true that there is more debate over whether we are in a more favorable environment due to the low interest rates and can afford more debt, or whether this is kind of more of a temptation, which is not going to last. So we should be careful. So this is kind of two different views. And I mean, it is a great achievement that in these 20 years we managed to deal with major fiscal crisis, and that we managed to, so to speak, have this kind of deep confidence in price stability, and the falling interest rates are to some extent also a positive development of this. Of course, there, again, the question is whether this environment that we're in now, where the monetary policies have been so expansionary that they involve the purchase of assets, whether this is not also something that has negative side effects. There is quite a debate on that. But it's true, probably today, the old IMF thresholds of unsafe debt, 40% for emerging economies, 60% for advanced countries, one can probably see a bit more relaxed. Although I should warn, Spain got in trouble in the global financial crisis with debt below 60%, Ireland too, because their financial sectors were not in good shape. So, if there's one thing, perhaps there is no magic number anymore, and it's all a bit conditional. But it is true that that we are finding ourselves with much higher debt level that are easily financeable right now, and that we can be quite relaxed about. Still looking forward, the challenges.
Yeah. I mean, you rightly emphasize the importance of growth-oriented, future-oriented spending. So to protect the growth, which is so essential, to keep the debt sustainable. One other thing which I almost find provocative in your book, that you have this strong view on that there's a kind of optimum size of the government. You indicate a certain range, 30, 35 to 40% or so. I mean, economists, wouldn't we always say, well, this is all about preferences? No, we have Swedish preferences about the intensity of redistribution. We may have more Anglo-Saxon preferences on that. I mean, can we seriously expect that all this results in a more or less equal level of the optimum size of the government? I mean, if you could develop that a bit more.
No, Friedrich, I mean, you're right. And I think I put in a lot of caveats, but the very fact that I state such a range is provocative by itself already. And perhaps, yeah, I mean, it's good to discuss this. I think it's good to discuss how much spending we really need to do what we want to do. Because a lot of the spending that we see is not the conscious decision of the electorate from policymakers. It's generations of policies piled up on top of each other. We have a lot of policy inconsistencies. We have a lot of policy inefficiencies. And this kind of discussion on what governments should do and what instruments it should use and how much money it really needs for that, I think is an important discussion to have after decades where we've just basically kind of moved on a day-by-day basis and rarely taken strategic choices. The last time in Germany was a bit under Schröder, when they strategically did a lot of structural reforms and cut back spending in a number of areas. A number of countries have done that, as I mentioned, in the 2010s, in the 90s, and the 80s. But yeah, well, when I came to Singapore, the first comment I got was, how can you say that spending should be 30 to 35%? We have only 18, and even in the crisis, we only got to 28. Now all my people will say I should spend more. And look around, things are going really well. So, Singapore is doing with less, and I get some criticism here.
Look, I was thinking about Singapore. When I heard you were moving to Singapore, I thought about the Thibault model, in public finance, according to which people move to that government which is closest to their preferences. But on Singapore and the low government spending ratio, is it some services that you miss, that you have the perception, well, here I would rather prefer more European levels of spending?
The big difference is really the welfare state. The pension system is funded, which means that pensions are not quite as high as in Germany. There is a big a defined contribution component in there, and you see a lot of old people working part-time or even full-time to top up their pensions, often because they are bored, as they say, but probably also because they can well use the additional money. The health system is a lot more market-based with own contributions and so on. Would I say that I miss this? No, for me not. Would normal people perhaps prefer to be in a single or double room instead of 5 people in one room? Perhaps, but it's a question of choices, and people here save basically for their even the health insurance is partly a savings-based system. So I think the system is less generous, but it has better incentives. So I mean, this is a well-functioning country as well-functioning as any country in Europe. So I think this is good. And some of the things, some of the spending level is also a bit artificially reduced by the fact that you have the pension system in a kind of parastatal, where statistically it's outside the government, but effectively it's not dissimilar from the Swedish funded system and so on. So, but generally, I think the point I made about emerging economies like Korea also spending of below 30%, very good shape, good government services. Difference is the welfare state. One has to also think a bit from the perspective of the financing side. What does it mean to have low spending or high spending? It means high taxes, high social contributions. It means possibly more distortions, less innovation, less dynamism. And I do see a bit of that also, that, this, on the one hand, we have a great sense of security, and I think a lot of our creativity and societal dynamism is kind of based on a relatively stable and secure system. But on the other hand, when you look at economic dynamism, and the vibrancy of the system, and the incentives it creates for people to do better, to better their own lives with their own efforts, that we can also learn from that. So I think there is really quite some scope for mutual learning that is reflected in these numbers. And in a way, the optimal size of government of 30, 35, whatever percent is also a bit of a reflection of the kind of society. The risk of that, of us becoming a bit too saturated, too slow in our societies. Mind you, the Swedes or the Scandinavians managed to combine dynamism relatively well with big government. So there is no one size fits all, but I think it's worth the reflection.
And I think, what's really essential also to understand your book is really that your point is so much on efficiency. So it's in the end not so much the level of spending, but how efficiently is it spent, right? And on efficiency,
and the anchor and trust. That it's not la pour la, it's not some kind of cold-hearted efficiency, but it matters because a government that performs well, people trust in. So it is also good for our stability, for our societal stability. And a well-performing government is also best for the poor because it provides opportunities to better their lives. A poorly functioning government is the worst for the poor.
Yeah, I found this idea really fascinating in your book. This idea of the virtuous cycle, the virtuous circle from high government efficiency, a trusting population. A trusting population is also more compliant with tax laws, so you will have higher tax revenues. You will have the absence of corruption because the absence also of a very costly administration, because you have compliance because people voluntarily comply. So this is like a good equilibrium. Let's call it, I don't know, would you call it a Scandinavian equilibrium or so? And then you have another type of bad equilibrium where trust is missing, where inefficiency of spending is low, where corruption is increasing. And where people get increasingly the perception, well, here it's just the rich who grab all the wealth, and this again is supporting again new redistributive impetus, higher taxation, and you go in a downward spiral. So I found this really a very convincing approach. The question is, what do you learn from this economy policy-wise? So how can you move from a bad equilibrium to a good equilibrium? I mean, at ZEW, for example, colleagues are doing research on what fosters tax compliance. So like does a more simpler tax system, which is easier to understand for taxpayers, will foster also compliance, will foster trust in the government compared to very highly complicated, with many clauses and so on. So what is your take on this? How do you get from the bad, low trust environment, low efficiency environment to the good, high trust, high efficiency, lean government equilibrium?
Difficult question, but a good question. I mean, I've looked at reform episodes, over the 80s, 90s, and 2010s. But I did not kind of check too much whether afterwards trust was better than before, except for the 2010s episodes. The book has a little chart there showing how after the reforms and with the economies then recovering, also trust improves. And I think also you see in quite a few countries that undertook major reforms, a real regime change away from this rent-seeking, crony capitalism mentality, where spending is basically there to be appropriated by special interests, to a rules-based system, market-driven system, where governments need to perform just like market participants need to perform. I mean, perhaps the ideology around it was strongest perhaps in the UK or New Zealand or places like that. But in practice, the Scandinavians have done the same. The Scandinavians have transformed massively from a very bloated system in the 80s, where Sweden was on the verge of bankruptcy. They paid 500 basis points spreads over, benchmark bonds in the early 90s in international financial markets. They were really in the doldrums. And they turned around the system. They kept big government, but they turned around the system. And well, would that be possible still today? I think there are two issues that matter. First, the ideas that dominate our thinking. I mean, unfortunately, we seem to be now in a mindset where, more industrial policies, more spending will solve things. I mean, if governments have been inefficient in the past, with the institutional framework they have, why should additional spending improve things? Why should additional investment spending improve things if governments in the past were not able to produce the project pipeline, the investment pipeline? And there's plenty of private money around with which we could finance infrastructure projects. We don't need more public money. We need better governance, better institutions. And I think that, in a way, is the focus that we should return to this focus a bit in our debate and away from the kind of macro fine-tuning perspective. And the other thing is political economy. And there, I'm afraid to say, when you look at the reform episodes, almost all these countries were pretty much at the brink, including Germany in the late 90s, early 2000s. People basically realized that they couldn't go on like this. And we are not yet at that point. So I don't think that much will happen. But in principle, we should get prepared, because we know that with these high debt ratios and at some point monetary environment will change. So we will get back to that point. And then I think is the moment to seek these new equilibria.
I don't know, what is your view? I mean, I fully share also from our past research this insight that unfortunately you seem to need crisis for reforms. But now the corona crisis is a very different type of animal, because here we have the dominating narrative. It's not the fault of the countries, it's an exogenous event. So all this economic downturn, it has been the virus, and you can't complain, you can't accuse any government. I would say, or I don't know what is your take on that, I would say that's a very incomplete view, because I mean, the condition, the resilience on the eve of the pandemic has been very different, and this is endogenous. So it's determined by policymakers, it's determined by voters. So the state of public finance, but also the flexibility of a public administration and everything. So I'm a bit afraid that we might miss a chance of the Corona crisis for another reform push. So what is your view on that?
I agree, but it'll come with a delay because the problems will come with a delay. I mean, we have now basically used a lot of the fiscal room for maneuver. I mean, in terms of debt levels, we've been set back by a full crisis. I mean, that is up 20% of GDP. Now, the monetary policy environment prevents us from seeing any effective fiscal crisis. We would probably we would probably have them now, and we will have them in the future potentially if we get into an environment of rising interest rates. So then I think we may get to undertake the reforms that we don't undertake now. Now the discussion goes in the opposite direction. I find that puzzling because if you look at the performance of governments and the market in the crisis, I mean, they both need each other. We know we need good rules for the markets, but the markets did their job and developed vaccines in record time. And governments did their jobs too. And I think the fiscal support packages were actually surprisingly good. I think one can be quite satisfied with that. But governments were slow. Here in Singapore and in Southeast Asia, now we have the second wave. Why? Because they did so well in the first wave with the zero COVID that they kind of became complacent on that and didn't start the vaccination programs, didn't order the vaccines. So now they're scrambling and, they have the problems that we basically had last autumn. Even though they could have perfectly anticipated that this would hit them. And even if the probability is not 100%, to spend a bit of extra money to prepare with vaccines. So even well-functioning governments like the ones here in East Asia have been slow. And
to hear, Ludger, that's good to hear. And that not just European governments are slow, but also the dynamic Asian countries are slow. I mean, you have a quite a positive tone on these Corona packages. I mean, you're also an expert on European policies. No? You have been with Central Bank, German Minister of Finance. I mean, let's maybe also have a short look at how you assess the European fiscal approach. Now, we have this big innovation. Here, it's true that the crisis was the opener for big reforms. The question is how beneficial they are. So the big reform I'm talking about is the Next Generation EU Fund, which is now financed, fully financed from EU debt that is guaranteed by the EU budget and indirectly guaranteed by the member state who promise the EU budget to pay for it if, for example, there are defaults on the side of the creditors. So, do you think it's really a responsible move? I mean, this whole Next Generation EU facility wants to really incentivize digitalization, climate policy. So, all this sounds good, but on the other hand, this joint debt construction could also be a change in incentive. So, how would you balance that?
I mean, I think the European governments were in a terrible situation in the early Corona period, not only because of the pandemic, but there was really the risk of an Italian debt crisis coming on top of the Corona crisis, where Italy was also one of the hardest hit countries, and the debate started, I think, also to become really negative, given that this was indeed even though you're right, the consequences were somewhat endogenous, but I mean it hit everybody, and that at that point, so to speak, Italy was at risk of a fiscal crisis because the financial markets were in turmoil, etc. I think it was politically wise to come up with a European response, which involved the ECB, by the way, with its asset purchases, to prevent that from happening. I think politically that was wise. It was also a good decision to give grants as a carrot, to give them for productive spending and reforms. What to my mind was kind of from that angle perhaps could have been done better is to acknowledge that for some countries the main challenge was not the need for additional spending, because even in Italy the lack of infrastructure is not really the consequence of a lack of public money. It's governance, it's processes, lengthy, etc. Just like in Germany. So for some countries, I think it would have been simply better to use the money for deficit reduction and debt reduction, or maybe even tax cuts, at least temporary. Well, although that's difficult. But okay, good. Now you can say that the additional spending that is monitored under the EU is not all really additional spending, because some of it is just shifted into this package. So fine. But the positive side of it is that it's monitored. It's a carrot. Hopefully, it is actually now followed through. I'm at two minds. When I look at Italy, I think one really sees the clear will of Draghi to use this opportunity and bring the country forward, but that's not the case for all the countries. But Italy is certainly the most important one where this should happen. And then on the financing side, if you allow me to speak a little bit longer on that, to issue European debt for this as a one-off under Article 122 and in the EU context, not just the euro area context, I think had quite a few things going for itself, in the sense that it is potentially in compliance with the constitutions of the member countries. It is a real crisis, and it was a strong signal. And you wonder how else it should have been financed. Tricky. ESM, well, you probably, that money is for country-specific reform programs with conditionality. You don't want to blow it on this. So I can't think of something better. What does bother me about this is two things. First, this de facto joint and several liability. One could have knit that differently. That each and every country can potentially be liable for the whole thing is in the financing regulations is really I don't know whether that was necessary. It's a big potential, but it's a game changer potentially in combination with the second problem, that the day this was agreed, some European politicians and one leading central banker, the head of the ECB, immediately demanded for this to become a permanent or at least a repetitive mechanism. And, then you wonder, okay, we want the rule of law, we want support for this from all citizens in Europe. I mean, can't you at least wait with this demand till the next crisis and not do it kind of on the eve of signing the support package for this one? So it creates a bit of a bad aftertaste, where perhaps one should relax a bit, because a lot of these remarks are for the domestic political audiences. So the Italians speak for their audiences, and the French for their audiences, and the Germans for theirs. And one should perhaps have a bit more confidence in the European policy framework. But still, it's a risk. As you say, it's a potential game changer and a risk.
Ludger, a different dimension or a different access to what you're writing. So, I mean, you emphasized very much the efficiency and the structure of spending, but you didn't go so deeply into this federal discussion. I mean, you have co-authored with Alberto Alesina, I think it's one of your most authored papers on what the EU should do, and we must say the ZEW we owe a lot to this because we have then taken this up and elaborated on this, on added value check. So where could Europe do or provide more potential compared to the member states? I think practically everything what we have written down was in Ludger Schuknecht, so to say. So when you look at spending, Europe, it's increasingly not a question, should we spend more or less, but where should we spend? So should the money be spent on the national level, or should it be spent on the European level? And both you and your paper, and we confirm that, I think we agree that there's a big potential for Europe to shift spending, for example, on defense, on migration, on climate policy from the national to the European level. So isn't this really a topic where a dimension where much more should be done in order to further increase the efficiency of the public sector?
Yes, in principle, yes. In principle,
Practice?
Yes. Look at the European level. There are good reasons to argue for a kind of a more European foreign policy, even defense policy. But it boils down in a way also to a matter of trust, and that means it takes time, and it boils down to the question of, even if we want to provide this common public good, does it have to be at the European budget level? It doesn't necessarily, because the financing could also be done by kind of an allocation mechanism from the national governments. What does it really mean, to have a European foreign policy? It's really decision making. It doesn't necessarily mean that nobody has an embassy anymore. Bavaria has an embassy in Brussels, or a kind of representation. And of course, Germany would continue to have representations in other countries. So I think it is also a bit a question. It's perhaps less a question of, so to speak, at the time in this paper, we argued a bit differently, but today I would say, the key is that you identify the policy objective, and then you develop the governance structure that achieves the policy objective, and then provides the financing in a manner that is, efficient and sustainable for that objective. And it's true that in the EU budget, there's a lot of spending that could be reduced to increase spending on these other objectives. And altogether, these are objectives that are typically relatively cheap. Defense, we are now discussing in Germany an increase of the defense budget from what I think about 1.5 to 2% of GDP. This is a fraction of what has been incurred in additional spending on social matters in the last couple of years. And, and for a functioning European defense, I think it is much more important at the European level and at the NATO level, that we agree at what level it is, and then that the coordination actually functions well, than whether, the tanks are bought by Brussels or by, Brussels. NATO is also Brussels, so, or in Berlin. So I agree with you that the focus in Europe should be on where the European value added can come from, but there is no need for what many people claim, a big European budget to actually do these things in a good manner.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ludger. Now we are already coming to the end of our talk. I think it's really interesting also to hear a bit about now your personal career, or how you look back at the past years. And my first question here is really, why did you now go back to academia? Is it that you were exhausted after all these difficult missions? You were in the OECD, the German Ministry of Finance, the ECB. You were there active in basically in dealing with the crisis, the post-crisis policies and everything. Is it that you now had the feeling, now I need a reflection time and to really digest all what I have seen in the political processes? And also, what exactly are you doing in Singapore? This it would be interesting to hear about from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a pleasure to comment a bit on that. no, the 7 years at the German Ministry of Finance were really a great time, a fascinating time. And I loved to work for Schäuble. And we had a great team there with my boss, Thomas Steffen, and many of the other colleagues, some of them still there. But it was really exhausting. And then I was at the OECD for 2 years, and as deputy, I mean, it was not quite as tough as in Berlin, but it was also an exhausting job. And the OECD is a great organization. But after 2 years, my term was up, and I felt that also, I mean, it's the time to take a break. And you quoted my CV. I've always been drawn a bit between the two worlds of practice and academia, and I love to write. I also love to teach, although I've although I've not got as much as experience with that as with writing. So then this interest and offer from Singapore came, and I thought, wow. And you know, my wife and I, we've wanted to live and work in Asia. You know, we've thought about this for a long time, and then this opportunity came to do it in one of the most exciting and interesting places of Asia. And so then we took this up. And what am I doing here? Well, right now it's the semester holidays, so I'm doing research and giving talks. But also, you know, the government has contacted me with some, you know, meetings and requests, and private sector, financial sector people. I'm quite engaged there, and so yeah, it's a great complement. It's a great continuation, to my mind, of what I've done before. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I don't go back to an more operational job again.
Mm-hmm. And that would also be interested to hear, what is the perspective of your colleagues there in Singapore, of your professor colleagues on the European Union as such? So I mean, we sometimes we see ourselves here in Europe as a continent with a lot of problems. I mean, what is the outside view on the European Union as it is today?
I would say that the focus in this region is clearly on the US and China. China as a partner in many ways, and as a bit of an unknown quantity for the future. And the US as a partner, but that tends to be a bit absent because there are other priorities. And, you know, the countries of this region straddle these two poles in different ways. But that is their main challenge. On Europe, and this I think it links up to what I said before, they really wonder what we are doing. That we are not getting our act together, and not necessarily from the perspective of why don't we create the European superstate and, you know, everybody pays for everybody else, but from the perspective of like, okay, I mean, you know, we have a couple of problem countries. You know, here it's very much about self-reliance. You know, so why don't we reform to become dynamic again? And this competition from emerging economies, I think, is going to be something that we should not lose sight of in our European navel gazing, where too much energy is absorbed of how we can or not do our next rescue operations for our neighbor and fend off or promote our next moves of integration, where we wonder whether they're going to be an improvement or not.
So taking this international competition serious, that's a good last word.
That's the key. I think they see us as a great potential. They see us as a great partner, but I think they really hope that we get our act together and become and strengthen ourselves again.
Yeah, great, Ludger. So I think we made a a long way from fiscal policy to the perspective on Europe from Singapore and the Asian region. It was fun and also very insightful for me talking to you. I would recommend the audience. I mean, you go on vacation, you're looking for good books to reflect a bit beyond, the just day-to-day business. So I really recommend Ludger's book to you. It's a great read. Ludger, enjoy your time in Singapore and hope to see you again in future, maybe also on site. That is always nice. So all the best to Singapore. So the last thing I would like to do is to announce our next book talk, which is on the 27th of July. Joel Slamrod, Michael Keane and will present their book on rebellion, rascals and revenue, tax follies and wisdom through the ages. And this book talk will be moderated by Achim Wambach. So hope to see you again here at our digital book talk at this occasion. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.